All right, so we're going to talk about cycles now. There are a few of them we're going to talk about, and these are mostly abiotic, meaning non-living things are contributing these to the environment. And so we're going to start with the water cycle. So the water cycle is simply the movement of water, and it's pretty simple. We have evaporation, which is where water goes up into the atmosphere due to heat. Anytime that you heat up anything, you cause the molecules within it to vibrate. And when you cause that vibration, what you're going to do is make it harder for hydrogen bonds to persist. And so the cohesive forces that keep water together as a fluid that we talked about in the last chapter, those are going to go away. And so you're going to have evaporation. Now, as you go up into the air, it's going to get colder. If you go to the top of Mount Everest, for example, it's much colder than at the bottom. And so what's going to happen is cohesion is going to reform and we get clouds. We call that process condensation. And then condensation will continue. And sometimes we'll get two clouds that hit each other, of which are the cumulus nimbus clouds. There are other clouds that are above the cumulus nimbus. We call those stratus clouds. And that is due to the continuing evaporation by the sun on the top of the cumulus nimbus. But for the cumulus nimbus, they will combine usually. And then once they do that, they will precipitate. And the way precipitation usually works is there's some sort of particle that's heavy, like a particle of dust, and we will get adhesion to that. And then cohesion will form a water droplet. That water droplet is too heavy to remain in the air, and it will fall as rain. And actually, Russian scientists knew this during a drought. They took a jet, and they flew it overhead, and they sprayed concrete dust, which made it rain. This might actually be why rain dances work, why in certain indigenous tribes they would dance and dance and dance for hours, throwing large clouds of dust into the air. Oddly enough, it would make it rain. And that's a great example of how sometimes superstitions are proven true by science. Moving on. The carbon cycle is an interesting one that we should really make sure we understand. We are living in a time where your knowledge of the carbon cycle can really help you to understand like a political debate. So what is the carbon cycle about? Well, mostly CO2. CO2 exists in our atmosphere, and it's a good thing that it does. We have this sun, and we have this earth, and the sun is hitting our planet with radiation. Now, what that would do is it would make one side of the earth so hot that we couldn't live there, and then the other side would be cold as space. And so why doesn't that happen? The reason that doesn't happen is because we have this shield. That shield is called our atmosphere, and it is made of greenhouse gases like CO2. And so CO2 blocks the dangerous radiation while allowing some of it in. And we call it a greenhouse gas because it creates a greenhouse effect. If you've ever been in a greenhouse, it is warmer than the outside, and that is because it is trapping heat in the same way that a sweater would keep you warm during the winter. You know the sweater isn't making heat. That would be ridiculous. You are making the heat. The sweater just isn't allowing it to leave. And so our Earth has a sweater, so to speak, and it is made of things like CO2, water vapor, ozone, and other such molecules. And that keeps some of the heat from leaving. Some of it still leaves. If it didn't leave, the planet would be too hot. But a good portion of it remains. And so this creates the temperature of our planet. Here's the problem. CO2 gets sucked up by plants. And then, when those plants die, they enter the ground as sediment. That sediment is pressurized and decomposed and eventually becomes oil and other natural gases. And then it's supposed to sit there for millions and millions of years. But we are pulling it out of the ground and throwing it into the atmosphere. And so what is that doing? It's making our atmosphere too thick. And so what used to be a sweater is now a heavy jacket. And the problem is getting worse and worse and worse. And so what that's doing is it's trapping more and more heat in, and it's overheating our planet. And so far we have seen a 2-degree rise across our planet. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but you have to consider the fact that not every organism on our planet is as tolerable to temperature change as we are. There are some organisms that need a very consistent body temperature, and they can't survive if they don't have it. It is also causing chain reactions like ocean acidification. There's a whole host of problems with that. Anyway, so that's the carbon cycle, which is a little out of whack right now. Here we have the nitrogen cycle, which is also a little out of whack due to humans. The nitrogen cycle is pretty simple. You have about 70% of the air is nitrogen, and plants can't really use it directly. What has to happen is a workaround. The carbon gets into the soil where things like bacteria and fungus can turn it into a more usable form. And so where we typically find these organisms is on the roots of plants. They have a partnership with the plants. So the plants, they can give glucose to the bacteria because they make glucose during photosynthesis. We're going to learn about that pretty soon. But they can't really make nitrogen, so the bacteria give them nitrogen. And they have this symbiotic relationship. Actually, if you were to spray the ground with antibiotics, which kill bacteria, you would end up killing plants. Okay, so I mentioned nitrogen. Nitrogen is actually found in living things too. It makes your DNA. It makes up a lot of muscle tissue and organs. And so we need nitrogen. We have it in us. And so how can this caribou give its nitrogen back to plants? I mentioned before that there is a food chain, and nitrogen goes along with that. Nitrogen goes through the food chain. But then how does it go back? If it's a cycle, here's a hint. How can the caribou give its nitrogen back to the plants? So if we're working with decomposers, that means that the caribou can die. The tissues of the caribou can be decomposed, can turn into soil where organisms called detritivores further break that down into soil. And so we have two things that help with this. There's decomposers that break down the body, and then there's detrivores that turn that into soil. So it's a two-step process. So you can think of it like this. First, the mushrooms and the bacteria get at you. Then the worms get at you. Two-step process. After those two types of organisms have cycled you, you become soil and you help to grow plants. And so this is actually sort of a beautiful thing, isn't it? Native Americans knew this. And so what they would do was when their dead would pile up, they would plant them around trees. In particular, they would they would bury their dead around the perimeter of these trees, and that would then allow their ancestors' nitrogen and other compounds to be incorporated into the tree. And so in essence, they would become part of the tree. Very beautiful concept. And actually what we've seen is that made those trees really giant. The giant sequoia trees, a lot of them have the remains of natives around them, actually. But there is another way that doesn't involve death. There's waste. And so we know this. We actually use manure from the waste of things like cows and chickens and horses. But actually, you can get manure from anything that poops. You could have giraffe manure. You could have lion manure. You could have guinea pig manure. You could have manure from almost anything that poops. You could even have manure from humans. But you don't want to do that. And the reason for that is there are parasites found in manure. Parasites, they are living things, and they live inside of you, and they steal your nutrients or feed on you, and they usually cause you to be ill, right? But here's the thing. They are host specific, meaning they only infect their intended host, or at least usually. And so if we use horse manure, yes, there's probably horse parasites in it, but they won't affect you. And so it's safe. But if we used human manure, there is human parasites in that, and it will infect you. So that's why we tend to instinctively avoid human poop. If you run across dog poop, you are probably less likely to be grossed out by it than human poop. It's just an instinct. We know to stay away from it because of this. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle, how are we throwing it out of whack? Well, this is how. There are these things called limiting nutrients. It is a nutrient that is in least supply in environment. And this word nutrient is kind of misleading because it's not necessarily something that is eaten. A limiting nutrient can be sunlight. A limiting nutrient can be CO2 or oxygen or phosphorus. In this case, in this example here, the limiting nutrient for algae to grow is nitrogen. And so if you are a biologist and you're trying to help an environment, do you think it's a good idea to increase a limiting nutrient? You would actually be wrong in most cases, and here's why. You see, a limiting nutrient keeps things from overgrowing. And so we have this problem on the shore. So along the shoreline, we have farms, and those farms have manure on them from things like horses and chickens, not humans, obviously. And so what happens is it rains, and that goes into the water, and that nitrogen will cause algae to bloom. But here's the problem. Algae take in nitrogen, but they also take in oxygen. And so when the algae grows, it sucks all of the oxygen out of the water, and that makes all of the wildlife there die or move away. And so this creates dead zones. And we have dead zones like that that are really hard to restore. In fact, we have dead zones up in northern Maryland that are slowly expanding toward us. And hopefully we can get in front of that. Hopefully we can prevent that with safe farming practices. But we'll see. It's becoming more and more of a problem. And so no, you don't typically want to increase a limiting nutrient, because when you do that, you end up decreasing another nutrient, and that becomes the new limiting nutrient. So in this case, by increasing nitrogen, we actually decreased oxygen. All right, so here's an analogy for you so you can understand limiting nutrients. If you have 100 cheeseburgers in a classroom that I lock you inside of for a year, but I only give you 1 glass of water a week, what is the limiting nutrient? Well, it's obviously the water, right? Because that's the thing that is in least supply. Okay, so you get the idea of limiting nutrient. Next, we're going to talk about niches. So this is a huge topic in biology, and it's a huge term. If you ever take my ecology course, I have a whole course that I teach on this one subject. We talk about niche a lot. And you can sort of think of as a niche as a job, but that is a very oversimplified way of thinking of it. A niche is a combination of things, really. It is how you have evolved and your strategy in life. So it is all focused around this word called fitness. Fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce in that order. And so fitness does not mean the same thing as like when humans say it. So for example, everybody knows that Michael Phelps is a very fit person, but he hasn't actually had any kids yet. No, wait, he has had one. But he's not that fit in terms of biology. When we talk about biology, fitness just means how many kids you've had and how well you can keep them alive. And so if fitness is like a currency that you earn by doing your job, the niche is the job. And so every organism has a niche. For example, the cat's niche is to be a friend to humans and to catch mice and other small creatures. The niche of the owl is to be a silent, stealthy killer. The niche of the human is to build and teach each other and learn. So those are all different niches. So different species may have similar niches, and when that happens, they have to compete. So what we tend to do when there's a lot of life forms in an area is we create different niches. And so, for example, these fish here, this fish's niche is to eat vegetation, and the other fish here might have also eaten that vegetation, but there was too much competition. So instead, this one eats phytoplankton, this one eats zooplankton, this one eats insects, and this one eats aquatic organisms in the ground. And so they have all adapted different niches so they don't have to compete with each other. So I mentioned niches. What do you think a dog's niche is? How does it survive and reproduce so well? It is a very successful organism. They are all over the planet. Why has it been so successful? What is its niche? For me, the dog's niche is companion to human. Humans are successful, and therefore, as our companions, dogs have been successful too. We have a symbiotic relationship. We really do help each other. What is a human niche? So I would say the human niche is very diverse. We have the ability to teach each other things and learn very well. And that allows us to pass on information and then enhance said information. And that allows us to create technology. And then technology builds and builds and builds because we can teach and we can learn. This allows us to change our environment rather than our environment changing us. Most organisms, in order to adapt, they must go through evolution. The environment changes them. Humans, we have broken that mold. We change our environment. And so that is the human niche, if I were to put it some way. All right, so what happens when those niches clash? You have competition. And so competition can be between different organisms, but they can also be between the same organisms. So we see these organisms here, they're two males, and they are competing for the attention of a female. And here we can see two trees, and they're competing for sunlight. Next community interaction is predators and prey. This is pretty obvious. They sort of evolve alongside of each other. The predator must evolve to catch its prey, and the prey must evolve to evade its predator. So for example, we have the Venus flytrap here. It has little hair triggers that when struck at the right time will cause it to snap shut and start decomposing the fly inside. We also have this owl. It has feathers that are very, very thin that help to cut through the air. This makes it a very silent, ninja-like predator that can't be heard as it approaches. It has satellite-shaped ear feathers that help it to hear exceptionally well, and eyes that are adapted for extremely dark light. Basically, the owl is the ninja of the animal kingdom. And then we have the stilt-walking lions of Africa, which are pretty obvious. Okay, that was a joke. This isn't real. All right, symbiosis is another interaction between communities. And so symbiosis just basically means relationship. And so there are different types of relationships, and you all know this. There are people that you have good relationships with, bad relationships with, and sort of non-meaningful relationships with. There are people that you just sort of encounter and you never really have strong relationships with them either way. And so that kind of exists in nature too. We have, for example, commensalism. Commensalism is a relationship, but it is very one-sided. One person, animal or plant, one organism is greatly benefited, while the other just sort of gets nothing out of the deal. So for example, this bird gets a nice, safe place to rest away from snakes and other predators, and the cow sort of just doesn't even care. The clownfish gets a nice safe place to hide, and the sea anemone just doesn't really care. The crab gets nothing from this, but the barnacle, which is stationary and can't move, it gets transportation, which means it can now go reproduce with other barnacles that aren't its close cousins. So it can avoid incest by traveling. All right, so those are all one-sided relationships. I like to think of commensalism like a person you know who you pick up on your way to school. They don't give you any gas money, and they don't need to because they're along the way. It's not really an inconvenience. It's just sort of a one-sided relationship. They get a huge benefit. You don't really get anything. The next one is mutualism. This is where both parties are helped. This is a win-win situation. So for example, the butterfly gets nectar, which is sort of a sugary compound. And the flower, which can't move, like the barnacle, it gets to reproduce with distant flowers through pollination. Basically, the sperm of the flower, which is called pollen, attaches to the butterfly, and then the butterfly is going to go fly away where it will meet another flower and help reproduction. And so that is definitely mutualism. There's another type of mutualism here. You've probably seen this before if you've ever been outside in your life. I know that you all like video games these days. I do too. But take a look at a tree. Take a look. You might see this stuff growing on it. It's called lichen. This is a type of fungus that is beneficial to the tree. You might look at this tree and think, oh, that's a sick, disgusting tree. I don't want to touch it because I don't want to get green infections. But this is actually a partnership. You see, the lichen here can't really photosynthesize very well. But it has a partnership with the plant. And the plant, the tree in this case, will give the lichen some of its sugars from photosynthesis, and the lichen will trade other nutrients that only it can make. And so it's a very nice little partnership. Another great example of this kind of partnership is found living inside of your gut. Deep within your gut, you have bacteria. These bacteria are so prevalent. Actually, the reason why your poop is brown is because of bacteria. Most of your fecal matter is bacteria. It's dead bacteria, along with other solids that are included in your food. Bacteria are all over your gut, and they help you to break down food. You would not really survive very long without them. And so that is a mutualistic relationship. Until, of course, you die, and then they start eating you. But that's another story for another time. So parasitism is the bad relationship. This is the friend that you drive them to school, and then they steal your lunch money. Whereas this is the friend who actually gives you some gas money. So parasitism, one partner is hurt while the other is helped. Pretty obvious. You can probably imagine what's going to happen to these caterpillars when the eggs on its back hatch. The baby wasps will eat it. This is cancer on a tree caused by a virus, and this is a tick, which obviously steals your blood. All right, so what does commensalism mean? So commensalism means one partner is hurt while the other is helped. It is a one-sided relationship, like this barnacle riding on this turtle. The turtle gets nothing, and the barnacle gets transportation. Next, in community interactions, we have succession. So succession is just a process by which a forest gets older. And just like you have baby teeth that eventually grow into adult teeth, so too does a forest have smaller trees that eventually will fall out and give rise to larger trees. But it doesn't start with trees. If you have barren rock, that rock has to break down. And so we have things like lichen, fungus, and other stuff like that that will break that down. We call those organisms pioneer species. And so pioneer species will come in and break down that rock into soil, and that will create an environment that things like grasses and shrubs and small plants can grow. And then that will eventually give way to things like pine trees. These are coniferous trees that are green all year. And then those will eventually give way to larger deciduous trees, or very large coniferous trees like the redwood. And so this is a cycle. And depending on where you are in the world, and this usually has to do with how much water there is, you will get stuck in one of these cycles. So for example, in the desert, there's not even enough water for sand to become soil or rock to become soil. We also see this in the Arctic, where we have permafrost that never melts and soil never forms. But then we get things like grasses in the grasslands. There's not enough rain for forests to form, but there is enough for grasses. And then we have places like the tundra, the taiga, which is an environment where there are a lot of coniferous trees, but no big trees. But then you move further south and you start getting the biggest trees, where there is enough sunlight for that kind of thing to occur. So where you get stuck in here depends on the abiotic factors of that environment. Okay, so go ahead and tell me which of these is the final stage, and what do we call it? I mean, I guess this is kind of obvious. You call it the climax community. So the climax community in this case is like an oak tree. And so we would probably call this a hickory oak deciduous forest. However, we could not have any of this, and the climax community could be right here. Or we could have a climax community right here. This is a type of environment known as a shrubland. And so how much water there is or how much sunlight there is, that can determine where in this process of succession we stop. There are two types of succession. So let's go back and talk about those. There is primary succession and secondary succession. So primary succession is when rock becomes soil, and then secondary succession is when you already have soil present. And so obviously secondary succession is much, much faster. Primary succession takes a long, long time. And so for example, if we have a volcano eruption here, what type of succession would this lead to? This would lead to primary succession because as that lava started to flow, it eventually would harden and it would become lava rock. And that lava rock would be rock. It would not be soil. And so that would need to be broken down by lichen and fungus before it became some sort of soil. What about killing grass? If you killed grass, would that lead to primary or secondary? It would lead to secondary because if the grass is gone, there is still soil underneath. What would this lead to? It would lead to secondary. The fire will not get rid of the soil. In fact, it will enrich the soil. All of the dead organisms, the dead material, that nitrogen will be reincorporated into the soil and will allow for new trees to grow. And it's actually a very important part of succession. Without forest fires, succession can't really occur in many cases. The only reason why forest fires get out of control is because we do not properly manage our forests. We let too much debris pile up onto the ground, and then we have big forest fires. You're actually supposed to allow small forest fires to burn, and we are now realizing that. Yes, that's what so I should have just brought you here. So there are actually trees that don't release their seeds until they detect a fire because they know that nitrogen will be in the ground. All right, so these are biomes, and due to time, I'm just sort of going to go over this really quickly. A biome is just a classification of an ecosystem. It's just real quick. We have the tundra, not a lot of life here, too cold, and it is sort of like a desert. There's not a lot of precipitation here. What precipitation does fall does not get incorporated into the environment because it just sort of becomes snow or ice. Nothing can really grow here. But we do have life. So this is a bunch of fungus, mostly. This reindeer here, actually, its primary diet is fungus, not plants. It primarily eats lichen. And so we do have some life here, but not a whole lot. If we move a little farther south, we have the taiga, which in my opinion is one of the most beautiful of all biomes. The taiga is the biggest biome on the planet. It stretches all the way across the northern hemisphere. More land on the planet is taiga than anything else. Pretty much all of Russia, Canada, that's all taiga. Taiga is home to trees, and some of the biggest in the world, like the redwood tree here, that grows to be upwards of 400 feet tall. It's a pretty tall tree. All right, and then next we have where we live. So this is the deciduous forest. The primary thing here is that we have seasonal change. We have really cold winters, really hot summers, and so that creates an environment where we have trees that lose their leaves in the winter. The reason they do that is because there's no sense in spending the energy to make leaves if you're not going to use them. And so they just drop their leaves, they fertilize their own ground with the dead leaves, sort of a winter storage for the tree, and then they grow them again during the spring. The animals here are very used to change. In terms of their niche, they have a very, very broad niche. This means that they're kind of a jack of all trades. A raccoon can eat just about anything, as can a deer and a possum. They can survive in a wide range of conditions. Whereas, okay, so then there's the grasslands. Grasslands, they can only grow grass. There's not enough water for larger plants. And then you also have big herbivores that typically eat anything that does try to grow. Animals here are adapted to open ground, so they bury themselves to get away from predators, or they're just really, really big, or they can run for a very long time. And so that's sort of what we see here. The plants that grow here have to be adapted to fire, where they have this sort of system. So if you have a plant, typically at the top of the plant, there is what is called the apical meristem, and this is where it grows. But in places like this, it grows from the bottom. And the reason why is if it gets eaten by herbivores or burned, it can grow back very quickly afterwards. Next, we have the tropical rainforest. So this is the opposite of the deciduous. The tropical rainforest is very consistent. It's always got these factors. And so what we see here is a lot of biodiversity. We see a lot of organisms. And these organisms are typically, they have a niche that is very narrow. This means that they do one thing very, very well. They are not a jack of all trades, they are a specialist. Because they are specialized in one thing, they tend to go extinct more often because when that one thing is challenged, if they lose their job, they don't have any other options, right? Okay, so this is the tropical rainforest. And then lastly, we have the desert. Not enough rain. All of its moisture gets sucked out by our planet's Hadley cell, which is a trade wind. And that moisture then gets deposited onto the rainforest. So the existence of the desert is actually why the rainforest exists. Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.